Alright everybody, we're going to dive into using Photoshop with RAW files. So it gets a little bit confusing, not too confusing, about RAW files into Photoshop. So anytime you take a RAW file on your camera, which you should be doing, and you go to drag it into Photoshop, it doesn't open automatically in Photoshop. There's like an in-between step, and that in-between step is it opens the image in Adobe Camera Raw. Adobe Camera Raw is a plug-in software to Photoshop that's now included anytime you use Photoshop with a RAW file. It's not something that you have to download extra. It's embedded in Photoshop, but it is a step in between taking a RAW image and getting it into Photoshop. And so I'm just going to grab this folder over here. We're going to pretend, this could be your memory card that you plug in from your camera. These are raw files up here. So I'm just going to grab this raw file and I'm going to drag it into Photoshop. You could do this with one image. You could do it with 10 images. So, or 100, however many you want, right? If you did it with multiple images, over here on the left, you're going to have a film strip of all of those images. I just pulled in one, so it just has one. But you can pull in as many as you want. So for those of you that have taken 142 where we went through Lightroom, this is going to look really familiar, right? So this is a RAW editing software, Adobe Camera Raw. So notice, right, up here it says Photoshop CC, but right here it says Camera Raw 9.12. It tells me what camera I made the image with. It looks very similar. This is where we're going to do those raw edits. Remember, the raw edits are what are called non-destructive edits, right? We're not changing the actual pixels in the image. We're adding a preview on top of it, and we can always go back and get rid of it, change it, all that stuff. So, like I said, if you've used Lightroom, this is going to look really familiar, right? Lightroom is the raw editing, the develop module in Lightroom is based off of Adobe Camera Raw. And so I'm just going to show you how I use Adobe Camera Raw and then get my image into Photoshop. So, like I said, this could be an image straight from your camera. It could be an image that you saved on your desktop, wherever. So, once again, I want to pay attention to the histogram up here. The histogram is really important. So this might be a review, like I said, for the Lightroom users. But if not, remember the histogram is the visual graphic of the information that is displayed inside of this image, okay? So if you had multiple images, if you clicked through them, the histogram would change based on what image you're looking at. The important thing about the histogram is we want the edges of the mountains to end inside of this rectangle, okay? We don't want them to extend beyond the rectangle. So let me just show you what I'm talking about here. If I pull this over, let's go down here. If I pull this over here, all of a sudden, I don't have the valley of the mountain, right? The mountain coming down to the ground inside the rectangle, right? It ends over here on the far right with a peak, which means we're clipping information out of the image. And over here on the right, let me get rid of this. Over here on the right, we have our highlights. And so I see over here, these are all the highlight areas. So what this red mask is telling me is, under this red mask is going to be pixels with no information because that information is clipped out of the histogram. And I'm getting those red pixels by using this. These little rectangles right here, what are called clipping warnings. So over here's the shadow clipping warnings, over here's the highlight clipping warnings. If they're off, right, we don't see those red pixels. And the red pixels aren't part of the image. It's just showing you it's a mask. It's a warning that's saying, hey, under here is no information, right? It's just blown out highlights. And inversely, if we took the blacks and knocked them over here and brought the shadows all the way down, and I turned the clipping warning on, now I have these blue pixels and these red pixels. So this red stuff is telling me, in the highlights, you have no detail. There's nothing you can do, it's gone. In this blue, you have absolutely no detail. You've clipped out information in the shadows. And I can see that on the actual visual representation, right? I have a peak over here that's clipped and a peak over here. So we always want to maintain the information in our pixels, especially at this stage in editing, right? We don't want to get rid of information. You might not like how your image looks from your camera. You're actually not supposed to like how your image looks straight from the camera. But what we're trying to do in this stage, think of the raw editing as like we're going grocery shopping. We're going to throw all of the supplies that we need in our cart that we can then go and make a meal with. We're going to make the meal in Photoshop. We're grocery shopping in Adobe Camera Raw. So Adobe Camera Raw, we're not using it to make our image look as perfect as we can. We're trying to maintain as much information in this histogram as we possibly can. So now let's dive down below. So there's not a ton of things that I do in Adobe Camera Raw, but they're all very important that I do. So temperature, right? This is a place where you could change the color temperature of your image, your white balance. You know, that's great. This is, once you get it out of this stage in the raw editing and bring it into Photoshop, you can no longer change the temperature unless you bring your image back into Adobe Camera Raw. So you would want to do this, right? Most of you should be having your cameras on auto white balance, and they usually do a pretty good job, but you can always just tweak it a little bit. I always do that just to tweak it, warm it up, cool it down. Remember, color is subjective. It's on you to decide what you want your image to look like. I don't mess with tint. That's not really going to help in this case. It's like, it's too heavy-handed for what we're doing right now. So I do adjust temperature. I skip down to exposure. I might open the exposure a little bit, close it down a little bit, but remember, we want to avoid that clipping. So with exposure, we see these numbers over here. So right there it says -1. That's -1 stop of light. So that's just like changing the exposure in the camera, right? That's like this would be like overexposing 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. You can bring a really dark or really light image kind of back to life with this. And if you see, the exposure scale will let you go +5, -5. With that said, I don't recommend going +5 stops, -5 stops. I would keep it within +3 stops, -3 stops. Anything beyond that, you're really kind of forcing the pixels beyond what they can kind of handle, and you're going to see a lack of quality if you push it too far. Now, with that said, that's a latitude of 6 stops, -3, +3. You can get your exposure somewhere, it should be somewhere within that, right, to be usable. So I'm just going to bring it down, and I usually do this just to fine tune, so I'm going to just like bring it down maybe half a stop. That looks pretty good to me. Contrast, I don't really mess with that because we're actually going to do it in a more refined way, right? Contrast, which is the space between the blacks and the whites, right? This is just like kind of a dumb way of doing it. It's not really the most refined way. Let me set this back at 0. Down here, we got our highlights, our shadows, our whites, and our blacks. This is where I adjust contrast, because it's not just, when you adjust contrast here, it's adjusting the blacks and the whites evenly, and the highlights and the shadows evenly. Where down here, you can dial it in really specifically. So I'm going to open up the highlights a little bit, make sure I'm not getting any clipping, because if I bring it all the way over here, it looks really bright in the sky, but I don't have the clipping mask, or I don't have the clipping warning, which is telling me there's still information in there. So I am going to open that highlight up a little bit like that, actually quite a bit. I'm going to take the shadows, I'm going to knock them down a little bit. Remember, I'm not getting warnings yet, so I'm not clipping any information. Oh, now if I adjust the whites too much, I start getting that highlight warning. So I'm going to make sure that I don't get the highlight warning, because I want to maintain as much information in my histogram as possible. If I start doing stuff like this, I'm losing information, right? Groceries are falling out of my shopping cart. I'm going to take my shadows, same thing, and I'm going to just make sure I don't have any of those little tiny blue speckles in there. So right there, I just expanded the information in my histogram. I just threw all the groceries in my shopping cart. I'm happy with that. Now, just because I don't know why, I've done this for years and years and years, I always bump clarity up to +20. So clarity creates the illusion that your image is more in focus. It's not making your photo more in focus. That's impossible. But it is taking pixels that are next to each other that are contrasting, right? So a light pixel, a dark pixel, like maybe on the edge of this rock, the edge of this rock, and it's increasing the contrast between them to create the illusion that the image is more in focus. You don't want to go too heavy-handed with it, right? It starts looking a little crazy and pixelated. And if you go, you can like soften your image to make it dreamy like that. But I always go +20 unless my image is really noisy. If my image is really noisy, then I don't adjust clarity at all. I leave it at 0. So just to recap, in Adobe Camera Raw, I adjust the temperature to my liking. I might mess with the exposure just a little bit, not a ton. But remember, don't go above +3 or -3, even though the scale will let you. Contrast I skip. Highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks I use to expand the information in the histogram. And then clarity I bump up to 20 unless it's a noisy image. Once I do that, I'm going to just hit Open Image, and my image will now apply all those changes and open right in Adobe Photoshop. So that's the end of this video. The next video we'll talk about what we're going to do in Photoshop.